there, Cole Anderson here again on The Independent Pianist. Today we continue looking at some music of the not-so-distant past. This piece was written by Toru Takemitsu in 1992 in memory of the great French composer Olivier Messiaen. Takemitsu was a fascinating figure. He began his career in open rebellion, so to speak, against the traditional music of his homeland. For some time, Japanese traditional music was associated in his mind with his short-lived but very unpleasant stint in the Japanese army during World War II. He was conscripted in 1944 when he was only 13 or 14 years old. And as soon as he heard music from the West, which he heard during that time, he was fascinated by it and was immediately experimenting with the avant-garde. And it was only much later in the 60s when he began developing a keen interest in the music and philosophies of John Cage that he began to show greater interest in the traditional music of his homeland, and gradually he began to incorporate its peculiarities into his own music. He described his own biggest influences as being from Schoenberg and Webern on the one hand, kind of the Germanic side, and Debussy and Messiaen on the other, kind of the French influence. This was combined with some of the sensibilities of Japanese traditional music and ideas drawn from Cage and others, and sifted through Takemitsu's highly introspective personality, leaving a highly original soundscape. As I mentioned, this piece was composed after Messiaen's death as an homage to the great French composer. Takemitsu referred to Messiaen several times as his spiritual mentor. He also said, quote, "Among the many things I learned from his music, the concept and experience of color and the form of time remain unforgettable." And I think the reference to the way time is experienced is very telling, because that is one of the most striking elements in Takemitsu's music. Time and space are approached in a markedly different way than in music which uses a more traditional tonal organization. Appropriately enough, the piece does use many characteristic sounds from Messiaen's sound world. In particular, there is some reference to Messiaen's third mode of limited transposition, which was a favorite of Takemitsu's, as well as the octatonic scale. So this does bring up the issue, what is a mode of limited transposition? It's essentially a symmetrical scale, like the chromatic scale or the whole tone scale. In this case, it's a 10-note scale that alternates a whole step with a pair of half steps. The reason that Messiaen called it a mode of limited transposition is because you can only transpose it to so many pitch levels before the notes start to repeat. So just for example, the whole tone scale is a mode of limited transposition because there are only two using the 12 notes of our Western scale. One that has C in it and one that has C sharp. Whereas you can transpose a major scale to start from all 12 possible pitches and you'll get a unique set of notes each time. I don't go into it in the analysis in the video. I talk about other characteristics of the music there. Since this is a fairly arcane point, and Takemitsu is by no means slavish in his adherence to this or any particular scale, but you can clearly see how certain motives, such as the opening melody and the repeated motive that comes back some 8 times in the course of the piece, could be derived from this scale. It's a part of what gives this music its unique, otherworldly kind of character. So for any composers out there, if you are looking for more ways to expand your tonal palette beyond the traditional 7-note scales and modes, the major minor scales, the church modes, the pentatonic scales, I do recommend looking into Messiaen's 7 modes of limited transposition. The first 2 are the whole tone and octatonic scales, but the other 5 are quite unique and rarely treated on in typical theoretical discussions. But as generators of very beautiful and interesting sounds, they're extremely useful. Beyond the harmonic language, the most extraordinary thing to me about this piece, and Takemitsu's music in general, is the importance that is placed on the life and decay of sound in space. A great deal of focus is placed on allowing collections of tones to ring together and expand into the silence between phrases. The music, to me, seems to vividly depict musical brushstrokes across a vast canvas of pregnant silence. The melodic character of this music and of much of Takemitsu's music is quite fascinating. It's very fragmentary, and repeated motives that begin to take on almost the character of incantations recur repeatedly, which mark our place as we journey through this mysterious and magical sound world. Takemitsu finds several different ways to create beautiful music which are completely outside the context of standard tonal practice. In this piece, there's a definite centricity around the pitch D. There's an almost unceasing pedal point D in the left hand. Even when it isn't there explicitly, it's still suggested. There's no real use of typical tonal harmonies or progressions. Even those figures which outline triads and things like that do so rather by accident, I think, than by design. And that's usually underlined by Takemitsu's spelling of these chords. So you can see at the beginning, the left hand does outline an F-sharp major triad, but he spells it with a B flat instead of with an A sharp, which seems to suggest that this chord was derived from other means than a consideration of tonal harmony. So as I said, this pedal point on D is pretty much maintained throughout the piece, which also contributes to this kind of timeless, meditative, somewhat static impression that the music makes. And this is also very much akin, in my mind, to much of Cage's music and philosophy. This was Takemitsu's final piano work. He died only a few years later, much too young. And as wonderful as his piano music is, it's only a small part of Takemitsu's genius. He was a master orchestrator, discovering all kinds of fascinating instrumental combinations, oftentimes featuring instruments from traditional Japanese music. So I highly recommend looking into some of his orchestral music. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention his work on film. He was a prolific film composer. He composed music for more than 100 films, and probably his most famous score is from Akira Kurosawa's Ran, a masterful kind of re-envisioning of Shakespeare's King Lear. So if you've seen that movie before, it's worth going and taking another look at it and considering that it's Takemitsu's music, and if you haven't seen it, and you like Takemitsu's music, it might be worth giving it a look. So I leave you with this beautiful work by Toru Takemitsu, the Rain Tree Sketch number 2. And if you can, do please consider supporting the channel. You can do that either through Patreon, www.patreon.com/independentpianist. A pledge of any amount would be helpful to me to keep this channel going and alive. You can also make one-time donations through PayPal. I have a link for that in the description box below. I'm also available for teaching online. I have a few spots left in my studio, so if you're interested, if you're an ambitious pianist and you're interested in kind of giving your piano playing a bit of a zing, I can definitely help with that. Just drop me an email at cole@independentpianist.com and we can have a consultation. So thank you very much for watching, and until next time, take care.